Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yevamot Tet Zayin, another very, very interesting daf. Before we get back to all our relationships and complicated issues in Yevamot, which are going to go back tomorrow when we start the next chapter. But in the meantime, we get to have the fun of Talmudic stories, which are always kind of enjoyable and a bit of a different, like you say, sometimes a breath of fresh air. I know that Yevamot is not so easy to many of you. I could tell you also for me, it's complicated. And I just want to encourage you that this will get easier as we go on. But and in general, I get the sense that the Gemara puts in those stories to kind of lighten things up a little bit. Okay, today's daf is sponsored by both Hadran and the Shiur family in loving memory of Julia Kashitsky. Her contributions to the Jewish world and Torah learning are innumerable, and her presence will be missed. Today's daf is also sponsored by Rabbi Raymond Harari in honor of Vicky's special birthday and her studying many Masechta together with Rabbanit Michelle. And today's daf is dedicated to Refuah Shlema for Ruth Leah Bat Kadima Kehan. We, your Hadran Chavruta, look forward to seeing you as you get stronger and return to learning on your treadmill as you advance in the miles of Daf Yomi. Okay. So we're going to start with our story. Before our story, someone pointed out something to me yesterday, and I wanted to just clarify, and it's also important to review when we talk about this issue of Tzarat Habat. Okay, in case I wasn't clear about something, I want to make it very clear from the beginning. These are also new concepts, so it's good to always kind of review and make sure we have all the details straight about how Yibum works. So we're talking here about a situation, again, whether this is theoretical or real, right? It's probably more theoretical than actual, right? There's again, different thoughts about whether many people believe that polygamy really wasn't common in those days at all, and therefore these situations are entirely really theoretical. In any case, we have this idea that two women are married to someone, the person dies childless, right? Whether boy or girl, it doesn't matter, childless. Okay, if the woman's pregnant, we'll get to those issues. What if she leaves a wife who's pregnant? What do we do, etc.? But let's just assume basic childless right now. The woman has to do Yibum with the brothers. So now how does it work? One of the women with one of the brothers. Once one of the women does Yibum or Chalitza with one of the brothers, everyone else is now permitted to get married, right? All the other women are, so to speak, free to get married. Only one of them has to do the Yibum or Chalitza. But if the woman is related to the person in a forbidden relationship to the brother, and there's only one brother that she falls to Yibum, again, if there's two brothers and she could do it with the third, then they do it with the third brother. But if she can't marry the one brother that's there, or maybe she can't marry a few of the brothers for whatever reason, then there's no laws of Yibum, not for her, according to Beit Hillel, and not even for the other wives. Everyone is exempt, and everyone can go marry as they want. Anyone who, if you hold, let's say like Beit Shammai, that the tzara is not exempt, Beit Shammai says no, just the person who has a forbidden relative is exempt. But the second wife, she's obligated in Yibum, which means she either has to do Yibum or Chalitza. If she does Yibum, then she's married to the brother. If she wants to marry someone else, she would have to either get divorced or she would have to, or he would die, let's say, right? Once she does Yibum, she's now married to the other brother. If she wants to be free to marry anyone she wants, so she'd have to get out of that marriage in the way we get out of any marriage. She's basically his full-fledged wife at this point. So she would need to get, or he would need to die, and then she can marry anyone she wanted, assuming he dies with children, right? If he dies again without children, there's another brother, then she'd marry the other, she'd have to do Yibum with the other brother. So that's the idea here that we're discussing. So Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel have this big machloket about Tzarat Habat, which then we said has ramifications for Mamzerim. Because if she does Yibum, according to Beit Shammai, with the brother, according to Beit Hillel, she's exempt from Yibum. If you're exempt from Yibum, you're not allowed to marry your brother's wife, because that's a classic case of Erefa. Remember, Yibum overrides this Isur of Eshet Ach. That was, we discussed in the whole beginning of the Masechta. If it overrides that, why doesn't it override other Erefa? But it doesn't. It only overrides your brother's wife. But if there's no reason to do Yibum, as Beit Hillel says, you're exempt in that case. If the first wife is exempt, again, it doesn't mean first wife. I'm just calling it first wife to second wife. It could be any of the wives. It doesn't matter who we married first. But if one wife is exempt, the other wife is exempt as well, according to Beit Hillel, which means that she's not allowed to marry her brother's wife, which means that they view Beit Shammai's children as mamzerim. Then we have the whole thing. They didn't care. They married them anyway, whether it meant that Beit Shammai kept lists and told them whose mamzer in their eyes and they just didn't marry them. Or maybe it means that they said, okay, look, you did, we don't view it as a mamzer because people were following your opinion. Okay, but you could see why this would be a big issue, because even if they kept lists, or even if they said, will respect you. Still, it's still like marrying a mamzer in your eyes. So it's quite complicated. In which case, we're going to see this next story, and you can see why the Gemara was very concerned with, did Beit Shammai really act upon their opinion or not, which would then create these mamzerim in Beit Hillel's eyes. So we did see some sources yesterday after trying all sorts of sources, and we couldn't come to a clear conclusion. But then we finally found two sources which prove that Beit Shammai, in fact, acted upon their opinion. And we're going to see that right now. Tashma, starting from the beginning of Tet Zayin Amud Aleph, Bimei Rabbi Yosef ben Harkinas, this is not Horkanus, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus, although this will remind you of that famous story of the Tanurah shel Achnai, the oven of Achnai, where there was a big machloket and they put Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus in Cherem, right? When he made all the heavenly voice came down and proved that he was right and all these signs, but yet the rabbis disagree with him. And then he continued with his opinion and the rabbis put him in, they excommunicated him. It was a crazy story. It's going to reference this story, and it's going to reference another very famous story where also someone was rejected in the Rabbi Yeshua, Rabban Gamliel story in Brachot, right? That story is in Bava Metzia Nun Tet, and the story of Rabbi Yeshua, Rabban Gamliel, which appears in a bunch of places, and most prominently, the more detailed version of when Rabban Gamliel actually gets kicked out of the Beit Midrash, is in Brachot, Daf Kaf Zayin, when there's this argument about Tfilat Arvit, the nighttime prayer, is it Reshut or Chovah? Rabban Gamliel says it was obligatory. Rabbi Yeshua said it was Reshut. Rabban Gamliel asked Rabbi Yeshua, and he kind of lies. And he says, oh, no, I agree, it's Chovah. And then he said, but didn't you say that it's Reshut? And then he embarrasses him, and he makes him stand up. And then they kick out Rabban Gamliel, and then they bring in Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. If you remember, I'm just reminding you of the story because the details are going to come up here, that it was a debate who to bring. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, who was very young at the time, he was 18, but he had these white hairs that grew to make him look old overnight so that people would respect him. He's the one who's chosen in the end because he has his father and his zchut avod, as we say, and as opposed to Rabbi Akiva, who didn't have, right, his father, he kind of came to this on his own. And he had wealth, right? He had everything going for him. Whereas they tried other people like Rabbi Akiva, and they didn't. Okay, and Rabbi Yeshua, they wanted also, but he was the guy who was involved. They didn't want to do that. That would be really insulting to Rabban Gamliel. And then they go eventually and they, who's going to go and appease Rabban Gamliel, bring him back. Eventually, there's a lot of similarities we're going to see between that story and this one. And then also they open the doors of the Beit Midrash and tons of people come in that day because Rabban Gamliel had he kind of kept things only if you're tochol kibolo, your inside was like your outside. Beit Midrash was kind of a closed place. Okay. A lot of these stories have a certain critique on the Beit Midrash and what goes on in the Beit Midrash. So we're going to see something similar here. I'm going to base my commentary. I'll try to say who and who as I teach, but I want to tell you that I both based it on Yonah Frankel's book. Okay, that I'm showing you here, Sipur HaAgada, Achdut Shel Tochen V'Tzura. He has a whole analysis of the story. And Moshe Shoshan, who I've quoted here and there, he has an article that's coming out. It's not out yet, but he sent me the preview of it, the final draft. So I'm also basing it on that article, okay, which hopefully will come out soon, and then you can have access to it. Rabbi Yosef ben Harkinus, it was in the times of Rabbi Yosef ben Harkinus. Now, he was first generation Tanaim in the time of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. They permitted the tzarat habat to the brothers, meaning like Beit Shammai. Shma mina, what can you infer from here? Asu. Clearly, if they permitted it, the Beit Shammai people must have held like Beit Shammai. Shma mina. Okay, that's our proof. We could end right here. But thankfully, the Gemara goes into the whole background story to this situation. Gufa. It's not actually the background, but it's a story that developed because of what was known to be. Rabbi Yosef ben Harkinus hitilu tzarat habat lachim, v'haya hadavar kasher lechachamim. The Chachamim weren't very happy about this. Again, you're talking about a time when they were trying to have centralization of authority, and they didn't like that people were holding like Beit Hillel and other people were holding like Beit Shammai. They wanted to keep it unified. Now, mipnei shechacham gadol haya, right? They didn't like this big, important chacham, right? It's one thing if some random people are keeping this halacha, but this was a big Talmid chacham. Now, notice what it says here. It says in the days of Rabbi Dosa. It doesn't say Rabbi Dosa himself, but they understood that he must have been the one that permitted it. Ve'enav kamu milavo lebeit midrash. He was already old at this point. And his eyes, he couldn't see very well, so he didn't come to the Beit Midrash. This reminds us of Chagiga, right? The people who couldn't see, it was hard for them to walk, so they didn't have to go to Aliyah L'Regel. He didn't go to the Beit Midrash. Okay, so now you see this person who's kind of disconnected with the Beit Midrash. right? There's the Beit Midrash world, and there's the world outside the Beit Midrash. In fact, Yonah Frankel connects it with the story that we saw a few months ago about the whole debate, can you teach Torah in the shuk, or can it only be in the Beit Midrash? Here you're going to see almost a Beit Midrash gets created in his house, okay? So that's the way Yonah Frankel sets it up, that almost he's outside the Beit Midrash and he can't come to the Beit Midrash, but they're going to kind of create a Beit Midrash in his house. Amal mi umi yelech v'yodio. Okay, these words appear exactly word for word in the Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus story. Who is going to go tell him that he's put in excommunication? Same kind of idea here. Who's going to go tell Rabbi Dosa ben Horkinus that he is wrong, right? It's not easy to do that, right? He was a big Talmid Chacham, and they have to go and basically, and you're going to see how difficult it is for them. Amar lahem Rabbi Yeshua ani elech. So Rabbi Yeshua volunteers. V'acharavni, who's going to go after him? In other words, they said, it's not enough for just one of you to go. We need a front, a bunch of rabbis to go. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Okay, so then, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he's next. He'll go with him as well. V'acharavni. Okay, that's not enough. We need three, almost like a court, right? Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so we have the three main players in the other story, right? These three. Now they get there and they stand near the entrance. Okay, Yonah Frankel also sets this up. They don't really want to go in. They're nervous. They don't really want to go in. So how do they get in? Nichnisa shipchato. Okay, almost sounds like happenstance. She happened to be passing by, saw them by the door. She goes inside. Amralo. She goes to tell Rabbi Dosa, Chachmei Yisrael ba'im etzlecha. Okay, the rabbis are here. So Amarla yikansu. So he says, bring them in. V'dichnesu. Okay, so they get through the door. You have to think, why on earth did they tell us that the maidservant brought them in, right? Both Yonah Frankel and Moshe Shoshan asked this is an obvious question. When I read the story, I also asked, but you don't need to tell us that the Shifcha brought them in. But it's some kind of rite of passage, that they're nervous, they don't want to go in. Yonah Frankel sets it up well. It's like the world of the Beit Midrash and the world of the house. They don't know the world of the house. They don't know how to behave there. They don't know what to do there, right? They're nervous. Their home is the Beit Midrash. So that's where they know how to be, but they don't know how to be in the house. So they're nervous. So anyway, they come in. What happens? It's very interesting, this tfaso. He grabs him, maybe because he can't see, so he's touching, right? He touches Rabbi Yoshua. He recognizes him somehow, whether, his vision is poor, but enough to recognize someone he knows. And he pulls him on, he puts him on a bed of gold. Wow, that sounds, something glorious. Amarle, Rebbe, amor letamidcha achel v'yeshev. So Rabbi Yeshua says to him, but there's another one here, right? Go tell your other student to sit. Amarlo mihu. Who is he? I don't recognize him. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Now you can imagine why Rabbi Yosef doesn't recognize Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. He's a young kid, right? We don't know when the story happened, but whenever it happened, Rabbi Yosef is already older, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was younger than all these other rabbis. He wasn't around when he was in the Beit Midrash, which, by the way, shows how disconnected he is to what's going on. We all know these characters, but he doesn't know them. Amar v'yesh lo ben la Azariah chaverenu. Wow, I didn't know Azariah, my friend, had a son, right? He recognizes the older generation, doesn't recognize the younger. Kaha alav amikaz. He said about him the following pasuk. Nar hayiti gam zakanti, right? I was once a youth, right? We say this in our benching. And then I got older. It's a pasuk from Tehillim. We'll talk about this pasuk later in today's daf again. I've never saw a tzaddik that got left aside, and his child had to search for bread. Now, again, this fits in with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah being wealthy. How he figures this out, I don't know, but it says clearly, Azariah was a tzaddik, and look at his son, and he's not wanting for anything. So again, he grabs him and he puts him on the bed. Amarle Rebbe, amor letamidcha acher v'yeshev. Rabbi Yeshua says, but there's another student. Amarle Umihu, who's this other one? Akiva ben Yosef. Amarle Atau Akiva ben Yosef, sheshimcha holech misof haolam v'ad sofo, shev b'ni shev. Oh, you, at least I've heard about. I've never met you, but your name, you have this reputation that goes to the entire world. Everybody knows your name, and come sit down. Kamotcha yirbu b'Yisrael. So here these rabbis were a little bit nervous about coming into him, and yet he seems to have tremendous respect for all these rabbis, even the ones he doesn't even know. Now, they want to get to the point and they want to ask him, what do you have to say about Sarat Habat? But they have to, break the ice first. And they start asking him all sorts of halachic questions. You can see they're, trying to figure out how we're going to do this exactly, right? Sometimes you go in to have a big conversation with someone and start shooting the breeze and trying to get to before you want to get to the big boom question. Until they get to Sarat Habat. Amrule, Sarat Habat mahu. Okay, you ready for his answer? Amar lahen, machloket beit Shammai ubeit Hillel. He is a very parv answer, right? A very safe answer. Oh, that's a machloket beit Shammai beit Hillel. So they continue. Halacha kedivrei mi. Well, who do we hold like? Amar lahen sounds very much like the Rabbi Yeshua story. Halacha kebeit Hillel. Okay, he gives them the right answer, so to speak. The halacha is like beit Hillel. Now they're looking at each other. What do we do now? Right? We were supposed to trip him up and it didn't work. Amrule halo mishimcha amru halacha kebeit Shammai. This is like the Rabban Gamliel Rabbi Yeshua story. But they say in your name that halacha kebeit Shammai. Amar lahem dosa shamatem o ben harkina shamatem. When you heard those words, that Dosa did this, did you hear Dosa or did you hear the son of Harkinas? Because in fact, so let's see in a second. Amrule chaye Rebbe. We swear in the name, right? We swear Rebbe. Stam shamanu. We just heard it stam, meaning, okay, this could mean we heard Ben Harkinas, right? Or it could be, remember how we said it. Bimei Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas. It was said that in his time, we heard it connected with you, but not directly connected with you. To which he says to them, Amar lahem, ach katan yeshli. We're in this thing about achim and achayot, and we're talking about all brothers in this. So I have a young brother, Bechol Satanhu. It's very interesting. He's an ach katan, it's younger brother, but he's the eldest of the Satan. Okay, he's saying he's like a king in the world of the Satan. V'Yonatan shmo, and his name is Yonatan. V'hu mitamidei Shammai. And he's from the students of Shammai. In other words, you heard this connection with Harkinas, but it's not me Harkinas, it's my brother Harkinas. But be very wary of him because he can beat you in any halachic argument. This is a little bit of foreshadowing. He has 300 answers he can give you to prove that the Tzarat Habat is muteret, meaning Beit Shammai's opinion, she can do yibum, okay? Aval. Now, here comes the clincher. So now the first thing to note, and this they point out in these articles, that you start the story thinking, okay, that, and this is why Moshe Shoshan really views this as a big critique of the rabbis. You start this thinking, who can't see? Rabbi Dosa. He's the one who's blinded, who doesn't understand the rabbis. We know everything. We're right. We're coming to tell him he's wrong and set him in his place. But first they come in and they don't really know how to act, right? And then he doesn't even recognize them. It's like, here are these big rabbis who are very popular. They go into this house and he doesn't even know who the heck they are, right? It's a huge, knocking them down. Then they think they're sure they're right. And he says to them, no, get your traditions straight. Didn't you listen? Didn't you hear? Why weren't you paying attention? And we see again the seeing and the hearing, right? He can't see, but he can hear very well. And he's going to be, we're going to see the man of tradition. Okay. He stands opposite. And this is one of the points that Moshe Shoshan makes in this article, that he represents tradition. We're going to see that in the next minute, as opposed to his brother, the Satan, who represents the dialectic approach, the arguing, I could give you every argument in the book. But in the end comes Rabbi Dosa and he says, Aval me'id ani alai shamayim va'aretz. I'm going to swear in the name of the heavens and the earth, right? Like ha'azinu hashamayim v'adaber v'shma ha'aretz imrefi. She'al midocha zo yashav Chagai Hanavi. On this mortar, Chagai Hanavi. We're going back to the times of the prophets. V'amar shlosha dvarim. He sat on here and he said the following three things. Me, you think this is machloket beit Shammai beit Hillel? You think that I held this way? You're wrong. Number one, I didn't say that. Number two, forget machloket beit Shammai beit Hillel. There's a much earlier tradition that goes like beit Hillel. And this whole thing is ridiculous. And he says, what are the three things? Sarat habat asura. Number one, she's forbidden. She cannot do yibum. Okay, beit Hillel. Number two, Ammon u'Moav ma'asrin ma'aser ani b'shvi'it. Ammon and Moab were captured in the time of Moshe even. And then, in the time of Yoshua, they settled there and they became sanctified, okay, these areas. And therefore, theoretically, you should be having Shemitah there, laws of Shemitah. But in the second temple time period, when they came back in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, they didn't sanctify it again. This area they left unsanctified, even if maybe the Jews settled there, although I don't know if they did or not. But even if they did, they didn't sanctify it. We're going to see this in the Gemara soon. Why? Because they wanted to leave an area that wasn't sanctified, that the people there could, they must have lived there because that's the whole point here, that they would give Ma'aser Ani in the Shnat Shemitah. They could work the land, and therefore they could give sustenance to the people who were poor and needy in Israel who couldn't work their land that year. They would support them with their Ma'aser Ani. And we can accept converts from these two areas. Tarmod, by the way, is interesting. It's Tadmor, which is a city in Syria that was captured by Daesh, they destroyed tons of antiquities there. It's horrible. It was a real ancient city. It comes up in the Gemara, most famous, the last time you can light Hanukkah candles is until the people, the Gemara explains, what is the last people in the shuk? It's the Tarmudaim, the people who would cut the wood. People would go home and burn their wood. There's all different explanations, but it was this nation that sold wood to people in general. So yes, it's Palmyra. Thank you for pointing that out. So now you can accept Gerim. Now, what's the issue of accepting Gerim? So here's another interesting thing. We've been talking about Mamzerim for a while now. If we take people from these areas, if there's a suspicion that they're Jewish and they just don't really practice Judaism anymore, then there's a concern that maybe they're Jews who are now acting as if they're not Jews. So someone comes along and says, I want to convert. They don't even know that they had Jewish origins and that their mother was Jewish and they're Jewish. And maybe they're Jews. No, okay, so why can't you accept the convert who's a Jew? There's a concern that maybe they're Mamzerim. Because if they weren't really practicing Judaism, maybe they slept with people they were forbidden to sleep with. And maybe they're Mamzerim. So we can't accept converts from certain places where there's a suspicion that the people who live there were Jews and just are not practicing Judaism, but it doesn't matter to us, they're still Jews. And then their children are going to be Mamzerim, and then they can't marry our children. So we can't accept converts because it's going to create a huge Mamzer problem or Suffolk Mamzer. So in these areas, you don't have to worry. There's definitely no Jews. Okay, we're going to go into all these issues in a few minutes. But now back to our story. So now there's another brighta about this story, about what happened at the end of the story. So already we see that the rabbis are put in their place. You see that the rabbis were representing this tradition. And also Shuli Mishkan has an article in Flashback about it this week, also about the story with her take on it. There's this issue between tradition, right? She also talks about this, between the traditional, right? We have a tradition and that's what we go by, versus the dialectic approach, the arguing, the thinking, and the rabbis were coming up with, we want to prove to you that you're wrong. And in the end, they're proven wrong. And he says, it's all about tradition. What Moshe Sham points out is that really it's about humility. And that here you see that Rabbi Dosa is teaching them, it's all about humility. And it's not about, also the Beit Midrash, the inside, outside, that's more the theme of Yonah Frankel. Not everything has to take place in the Beit Midrash, first of all, right? He kind of says they create this Beit Midrash by sitting on this Mitav Zahav in his house. They're kind of creating a Beit Midrash in his house. But it's not everything has to happen in the Beit Midrash, and not everything is all about, we're so smart, we know everything. You really don't know anything, and he put them in this place, and sometimes, the person you least suspect might be the one who knows the most. And you'll see from the very last line, the punchline of the story, it's all about humility. So let's see how the story ends. When they all came in, okay, this is the idea, right? They came as a group, right? We're coming to attack. You come in together. But when they left 3 separate entrances. So there's many different explanations given why they left in 3 separate entrances. One idea, I think, is this idea. They came in as a group and then they walked out kind of deflated, right? And they just kind of walked out each their own way. Another option, some people say, is, well, they came in together and then they walked out separately because they wanted to find this Yonatan. And now we're going to talk about 2 different options as to why they were looking and why they separated to find Yonatan. One is quicker to find him if you go that way, and you go that way, right? We can find him much more easily. Number two, if we find him together and they were warned already that he's very smart and he might knock you down, if he knocks down all three of them, then they've got nothing to do. If he knocks down one of them, we still have the two others who haven't confronted him, and that would be okay. Some people think they're looking for him. Some people think they're trying to avoid him. Okay. And maybe that's why they kind of all walk away like anonymous people, and, they don't want to bump into him. So we don't really know if they're looking for him or not. In any case, Pagabo Rabbi Akiva. He bumps into Rabbi Akiva. Akshele ve'okme. Yonah Frankel points out this is the only Aramaic in the entire story. Okay. He claims that this might even be added after. Okay. I don't know. But in any case, it's here, and it's a very difficult line. And if you read different commentaries, they say opposite things about it, because it doesn't say, it's a good example of, it doesn't say who did what. So Akshele must mean Yonatan questioned them with many questions. Ve'okme. And he stood up, meaning he succeeded. Who succeeded? Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi or this Yonatan guy. So we don't know, right? The Koran actually says it's Rabbi Akiva, but I think the pshat is that no, Akiva lost, okay? Yonatan stood up with he ended up winning the battle. And you'll see from the continuation, it's very hard to understand it the way they explain the Koran, because Amar Lo, Yonatan says to him, presumably after Akiva lost the argument, and also it was already foreshadowed that he was going to beat you in any kind of argument. Atau Akiva, you ready for this? You're the guy who has the name that everybody in the world knows you. What an embarrassment, right? And that's why it makes more sense that he lost the argument. Afilu liroet son, you don't even get up to the level of a roet son. A roet son is known, we're going to get to in Sanhedrin, can't be a judge. They were known as people who were, I'm sorry, I missed it. I said the wrong thing. I'm sorry, I skipped the line by accident. My mistake. Very nice that you have a good name for yourself, but you didn't even get up to the level of those who herd, who shepherd the big animals. The big animals are not as bad as the small animals. We'll get to this in a minute. But the shepherds of the big animals were known. They're basically shepherds. How much do they know? They don't know so much. So they can't be judges. Okay, this comes up in Sanhedrin. So he says, who are you to think that you can pass on halacha? You don't know anything. Okay? Knocks him down. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva v'afilu liroet son. Here's the punchline of the story. Rabbi Akiva's response is not to say, what are you talking about? I know what I'm doing. He says, you're right. And not only are you right, you're wrong. I'm not even at the level of a roet son. A roet son has the small animals. What do small animals do? They graze in other people's lands, and they're considered thieves because they let their animals eat from other people's property. And those people can't even be accepted as witnesses. So Rabbi Akiva is so deflated. And besides from the whole Rabbi Dosa scene, then from the Yonatan scene, he's put down in his place, and he basically admits defeat. And he says, you're right. And what do you see here? His humility, right? That instead of trying to argue back and saying, I'm smarter than you and I have a tradition, he could have said, I have a tradition, right? He could have quoted the tradition of Rabbi Dosa. But instead, he just politely says, you're right. So again, let's try to look at the story from a glance. So Moshe Shoshan claims that this whole article, that this whole story is to basically show that there was people who were against the Beit Midrash in Bavel. And they wanted to show there's problems in the Beit Midrash. There's a lot of arrogance. And we see this in many stories, right? It was the same in the Rabban Gamliel story. It was the same, like this idea of it being an exclusive place, it being a place where, it's interesting. You think about the Hillel story where there was a guard at the Beit Midrash that wouldn't let people in. Here, there's a maidservant who just lets them right in, right? And Rabbi Dosa is very welcoming, and he has nice things to say about everybody, right? And he doesn't start judging them, and he doesn't start questioning, and even though they're really coming to attack him. And so it's trying to show that the Beit Midrash is problematic, and this is what Yonah Frankel says, it's the Beit Midrash, but the house, right, is a different type of learning. And, and again, it's the tradition versus the arguing and what wins out. Anyway, there's a lot more to be said here, but we'll leave it at that. Now we're going to go into one question that I don't have a good answer for, but you can think about, what's the connection of these three halachot from Chagai? Right, and why specifically these three things? Obviously, there's some mamzer connection of the last story. Why the Ammon and Moab? We're going to see Ammon and Moab come up in the context soon of marrying into the Jewish people, because we know Lo Yavo Ammoni Moabi B'Kal Hashem. They can't marry in either. So all of these kind of have to do with who can marry in, who can't. Right, Jews, non-Jews, which kind of Gentiles who can become a ger, who can't become a ger, right? It's funny, they don't really mention this, but they're talking about the land of Ammon and Moab, but Ammon and Moab can't be gerim, and then we can accept gerim from these other places. So it's interesting. Like they're sort of intertwined, even though they're not directly. Okay, now we're going to go through all these cases. Ammon and Moab ma'asrim ma'aser ani b'shvit. So Ammon and Moab, again, what do? They take the tithe of the poor man's tithe in the Shemitah year and use it to support the poor people in Israel. Da'amal, where does this come from? And I already told you this, but we'll read it inside. Harbe kachim kivshu alei Mitzrayim, v'lo kivshu alei Bavel. Those who came out of Egypt conquered all sorts of places that Olei Bavel did not conquer. Ukdusha rishona kitsha l'shata, v'lo kitsha l'atid lavo. The first sanctity was only temporary. This is only an opinion. There's an opinion that says once it was sanctified, it's continually forever it's sanctified. We've talked about this before, right? Which is why people won't go to the Temple Mount in certain places, because it's still, the sanctity is still there. V'hinichum, and they therefore specifically left off this area so that the poor people would have someone to rely on in the Shemitah year. Ini, is this really true? Rami Bar Yecheskel, Rami Bar Yecheskel says you don't accept gerim from Karduyim. How does that relate to, right? That seems like a direct contradiction. Ravashi, Kartuyim itmar. Oh, wait, don't confuse Karduyim with Kartuyim. Okay, those are two different places. One with the Dalet, one with the Taf. Kartuyim psulim. As people say on the street, Kartuyim can't marry in because it was a concern that there were Jews there and mamzerim. Ikeda Amre. Some people say that we'll get to the same conclusion, but how we got there was a little bit different. The order of events here was a little different. Some people say, first they brought this braita of Rami Bar Yecheskel, Ein mekablim gerim min kartuyim. First they just quoted his braita with the right words. Then they said, my lav hainu karduyim. They said, isn't Kartuyim the same as Karduyim? Right? You can imagine people just kind of confused exactly how to pronounce it. And then Amar Rav Ashi, and then that would contradict our Mishnah. Amar Rav Ashi, lo, Kartuye lechu v'karduye lechu kedam re'inashe Kartuye psila. No, they said, no. They're two different places. So either which way Rav Ashi resolves the contradiction, it's just a question, how did the contradiction come about? Rabbi Yochanan v'Savia, the Amrei Travayu, ein mekablim gerim min ha-Talmudim. Now we're going to get to the Talmudim and we're going to see that even though there's a braita that says we can accept converts from there, Rabbi Yochanan and Savia, whether Savia is a person, okay, and that's his name, or whether Savia is representative of the rabbis, the older generation of rabbis, they said we don't accept gerim from Talmudim. Now this is a little bit strange; they would contradict the Tanaitic source. So the Gemara first is, that's not really what bothers the Gemara, but the Gemara is going to say, did he really say this? It contradicts an explicit Mishnah. And we're going to see in a minute that we know that Rabbi Yochanan always holds like a stam Mishnah. That means if there's a Mishnah without a machloket, without a debate, Rabbi Yochanan always holds that way. And we're going to see that the simple reading of this Mishnah, or one reading of this Mishnah, is that he thinks that you can accept gerim, the Mishnah. And Rabbi Yochanan says you can't from Talmudim. So how does this work? What's the Mishnah? Kol aktamim habaim min harekem tehorim. Now we're talking about a different issue, which is blood of a menstruating woman who's Jewish is impure. Of a non-Jewish woman doesn't carry impurity, only Jewish women. So therefore, if it comes from rekem and you have these ktamim, you have clothes with stains and then blood stains that are assuming they're menstrual stains, so they're pure because the assumption is in rekem, all the people are not Jewish. Rabbi Rekem was on the border. It comes up in Gittin as one of the borders. We'll talk about that when we get there. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, these people are converts and they make mistakes. Now, whether this means, this could mean a bunch of different things. It could mean they're Jews who converted out, but they're still Jews. And that's why they make mistakes, because they treat themselves as non-Jews, but they really are Jews in our eyes. And therefore their stains are problematic. Or it means that they weren't Jews, they converted, but they don't really keep halacha. Okay, they're converts who don't really keep halacha, but right, they're still Jews because they converted. Mibein ovdei kochavim tehorim. Now, none of those lines were important. This is the line that's important. But if it's not from Rekem and it's just from regular Gentiles, we can assume they're impure, and everybody agrees with that. The Havinam, and they questioned and they said, "Kapasik v'tani mibein ovdei kochavim v'afilu mina tarmod." They said it sounds like they're talking about any Gentiles anywhere, which would include any Gentiles from Tarmod. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan said, Zot omeret, you can learn from this Mishnah. Mikablim gerim mitarmod. So there you see it. Rabbi Yochanan says, you accept gerim from tarmod. And he said elsewhere, you don't accept gerim from tarmod. So how do we deal with this? Maybe you could explain that when he said we accept gerim from tarmod, from this Mishnah, he's saying, Zot velo sfirale. One can infer from this Mishnah that that's the law, but I don't agree with that. Okay, right? Sometimes you could say, this Mishnah seems to indicate this. I disagree with it. But you can't say that because of what I told you before. He holds like a stam Mishnah. If there's no machloket in Mishnah, he holds that way. So it can't be that he disagrees with the Mishnah. So it sounds like we have a contradiction within Divrei Rabbi Yochanan. So the answer, simple answer, there's a debate among Amoraim what Rabbi Yochanan holds. Some people think that Rabbi Yochanan always holds by a stam Mishnah and therefore would hold this way. And other people said that he said that no, we don't accept gerim. So there's a debate about whether we accept gerim for Talmud or not, according to Rabbi Yochanan. So there's a debate about what Rabbi Yochanan actually held. Now we want to know, assuming he doesn't hold, like we saw that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold, we accept converts from there. The question is why? What's unique about Talmud, that city, that ended up with people that we think are Jewish? Mitarmod my time alo. Pligi about Rabbi Yochanan v'Savia. These two people, or two groups of people, we don't know whether Savia is a group or it's a person. They disagree about why we don't accept the gerim from Talmud. Chad amar mishum avdei Shlomo. The servants of Shlomo were from Talmud. Remember also he had a lot of wood and trees. They came from there. Because they came from there, what they do? They came to build the temple, and then they brought back Jewish women with them and brought them back to their communities. So it was all these Gentiles who married Jewish women. And some people say it was the women of Jerusalem from the time of the destruction, which we'll get to in a minute what that is. So that one makes a lot of sense. There's actually a debate about this, whether when you have a Gentile or Eved Knaani, a Canaanite servant, which is also considered a Gentile, who has, right, semi-Jew, but not for the purposes of marriage, who marries a Jewish woman or has relations with the Jewish woman, what's the status of the child born from that union? There's a debate about whether they're a mamzer or whether they're just disqualified for kahuna, right? They can't marry a Kohen. We paskin today, they can't marry a Kohen. They're not mamzerim. But it must be that this opinion, the person who held that it was Avdei Shlomo who slept with these Jewish women, we can't accept them as converts because the mamzerim must have held that if a Gentile or a slave sleeps with, again, a Gentile slave, sleeps with a Jewish woman and they have a child, the child is a mamzer. Ella, Lemanda Amar, Mishum Benot Yerushalayim, Mahi. What is this Benot Yerushalayim? When did Benot Yerushalayim have relations with Gentile men? So, Pligi Bar Rav Yosef Rabbanan, Utravai Mishum de Rabba Bar Chana. There's a debate about Rav Yosef and the rabbis about what Rabba Bar Chana said about this. Chadama, Tresa Alfe Gavri, Veshita Alfe Kashtuye, the Chadamar Tresa Alfe Gavri, Uminayu Shita Alfe Kashtuye. Either there were 12,000 soldiers, and of them, and in addition to them, 6,000 who have bows and arrows with them, or there were 12,000, which included 6,000 with bows and arrows, okay, that came. This is the people who fought against the Jews when they destroyed the first temple. When they came into the Heichal, what were they looking for? What's the best thing you have in the temple? All the gold and silver. Remember all the gold we talked about and all the silver and lots of money, right? They were after the Kesef and Zahav. Akol nifnu al Kesef Zahav. Everybody just came to loot the temple. Vehem nifnu al Benot Yerushalayim. But the Talmudim, they went after the women. Shenema, where do we get this from? A pasuk in Echan. Nashim b'Tzion inu. They torture the women in Zion. B'tulot b'arei Yehuda, the virgins in the cities of Yehuda. So they're saying these were the Talmudim. They took the women, they raped them or grabbed them to be their wives. And that's the Talmudim that we're talking about. Okay, so maybe they took them all the way back to their city. And that's who we're worried about now, these women that were taken from them. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonatan. We're now getting off on a tangent, and you'll see in a minute that we're going to have another statement in the same name of the same people. That's going to connect with our issue, and probably that's why it's here. Pasuk Zeh, and it actually connects with it, right? We're going to have a bunch of things that come full circle. We started in this story, remember he said about Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah, Nar Hayiti Gam Zakanti, so now we're going to have a drasha on that. Pasuk Zeh Sar Ha'olam Amaro. It was an angel who said this verse. Okay, it's a pasuk in Tehillim. Normally we attribute that to David HaMelech. So they say, Nara Yiti Gam Zakanti, Mana Marei, who said it? Right? One option is God said it. Okay, right? Torah was given by God, maybe Tehillim, I don't know. God, okay, maybe it was God. Mi kazikna kame, right? God doesn't get old. You can't say I was once a youth and now I'm old. God doesn't get old. Ve'ela David amare, mi kashish kulei. David wasn't that old. He died at age 70. He couldn't have said, I'm so old. And I never saw this. So he never got to old age. Ela shmamina sar ha'olam amaro. So it must be this angel of God that said. That was an aside. Now, Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonatan, the same rabbis who said, "Mai dichtiv yado paras tsar al kol machmadeha." Okay, this is another pasuk from Eicha that the enemy spread out and took all the treasures. Ze Ammon Moav. I told you we get back to Ammon and Moav. And the reason why I brought this is it's a parallel to the statement we made just 2 minutes ago. When they came to loot, right? Everyone was coming for the money, and then we saw, except for the Talmudim, came for the women. Well, except for Ammon and Moav, they wanted the Sifrei Torah. Why they want the Sifrei Torah? Not for the reason you would have expected. We want to burn this Torah because this Torah excludes us from coming and marrying Jews. And we don't want that pasuk to exist, so let's burn the Torah, and then we'll be able to marry. So again, you see this whole thing about the marriage, it connects, right? All these things are connecting it. The Ammon and Moav that we weren't talking about in terms of marriage before, but now they're connecting it with the issue of marriage. The Ammon and Moav are these nations, right? There we were talking about their land and whether it was sanctified or not. But now they're saying they wanted to be part of the Jewish people as well, and therefore they wanted to burn our Torah when they came in. Tziva Hashem liyakov tzvivav tzarav, another drasha on a verse from Eicha, Amar Rav, right? That God said to Yaakov, you're going to be always surrounded by people trying to attack you. This is what people always talk about. Right? They don't usually quote this verse, but here's a good verse for it. Amarav kigon homanya lefumnara. He says, the homanya lefumnara, those are people who are constantly surrounding Pumnara and torturing the Jews there, oppressing them. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Asi, the last thing for today, Ovei kochavim shekidesh bezman hazeh chosheshin lekidushim. This is a fascinating statement. If a Gentile marries a Jewish woman, now normally we say, en kiddushin tofsim. We've learned this before. You can have a marriage that's fictitious, basically. It's not viewed as a marriage at all. We saw some cases before, right? If it's chayve kritut or a forbidden marriage. So here's a forbidden relationship. Gentiles can't marry Jews. There's no validity to their marriage. Comes Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav Asi, and he says, you have to be concerned what we call safek kiddushin. Maybe she is betrothed, which means she's a safek eshet ish, a married woman. Shema me'aseret hashvatimu, he might be from the 10 lost tribes. So now they say, wait a minute. This doesn't make sense with our laws that we know of general rove. We go by the majority. V'ha kol de parish miruba parish. We say, if we have a random Gentile here and we don't know where he came from, he came from a city where most of the people are not Jews. We can assume they're Gentiles and not ones from the 10 shvatim that got lost, the 10 lost tribes. So the Gemara answers, it's in a place, if you're in that city where, we're going to see that there were cities where it was known that the people settled from the 10 tribes. In that city, we go by, it's called kavua. I'm not going to get into the difference why I call the parish miruba. We go by majority, whereas anything that's in that place, rather than it's separated from the place, we treat it as if it's 50-50, meaning 50-50 could be Jew, could be non-Jew. Okay. And therefore, if we're talking about in the city, someone gets married, if he's in his place of origin, we're going to treat him as if he's a 50-50, might be a Jew, and therefore his kiddushin is good. Why there's a difference called the parish and called kavua, I'm not going to get into now. That's a sugya that we're going to see much more in depth in a bunch of other places where it really is head on about Tesha Chanuyot. There's 9 stores, there's 10 stores, 9 sell non-kosher food, 1 sells kosher food, or the reverse, and what we do, etc. I'm not going to get into all the details on why we do this, but that's the principle. The principle is if something comes out from it's separated, then we say it must have come from the majority. And if the majority are Gentiles, we treat it as Gentiles. But if it's kavua, it's in its place, then we say 50-50. This is where the 10 tribes were sent to. Chalach ze chalzon, chavor ze chadayeb, nahar gozen ze ginzak, arei madai zo chamdam v'chavrotea, v'amrei la nihar v'chavrotea. Okay, this is basically defining what areas the 10 tribes went to. We don't know what these cities are, right? To us, they don't mean anything. To them, they meant a lot. They're identifying. These are the places, people from there, okay, thank you for telling us, Julie, that they're mostly Iraq, Iran, and Syria. People who come from there are we're concerned that maybe they're from the 10 Shvatim. So if you get married there, we treat it as 50-50 at Safek Kiddushin. If they separate from there, then we don't have to worry about it because the majority aren't. But if you're there, then you have to be worried. Okay, and that's another interesting halacha. We'll end with that for today. A lot to think about. And we're going to finish the first chapter tomorrow and get back to all the Mishnah and all these Yevamot cases. Have a great day, everyone.